Hello and welcome to God in Film, the podcast where a Christian and an atheist dive into the best that cinema has to offer and see if we can find any parallels with the gospel or any other Bible stories. I'm media coordinator and underappreciated genius, Giles Goff.
And I'm librarian and pet monkey, Julia Hall.
And today we'll be looking at the Fabelmans, Steven Spielberg's fictionalized version of his early life. We'll be looking at biblical rationales for divorce and what it's like to want to be holy when you are an exceptionally horny teenager. Julia, I made you watch this film for the podcast. What do you think?
It wasn't my favourite. I will kind of say that. I think I can understand why, for some people, they would really enjoy this film. But for me, I felt it was 2.5 hours and it felt like 2.5 hours. I think for me, I would have liked more of a decision between whether Spielberg wanted to tell his story about his love for film and how the way his films made other people feel and how that made him feel, or having it solely about his parents' relationship and his family relationship. Because I think trying to tell both of those stories, they're both such rich stories with such a lot to tell, that trying to do them both just kind of really was too much.
I see that because I remember looking at the running time on this again, and it feels like quite a slight film in a lot of ways. It's not weighed down with plot. And I remember seeing the running time again, be like 2.5 hours. How could it? What could it be? But if you think about it, Spielberg is basically the guy who popularized having divorced parents in mainstream cinema. You know, like the parents in.
He's the Jacqueline Wilson of cinema.
The parents in E.T. are divorced. So, like, trying to extrapolate those things when it's such a foundational thing for him, I can imagine he would find that really difficult, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's always easy as me, objectively saying, hey, dude, your film is too long, when Spielberg is out here literally, like, putting his heart and his guts into a 2.5 hour film and saying, this is me, this is my life. So I can't imagine how difficult that must be to an extent.
Some men will literally make a multi-million-dollar film rather than go to therapy.
$40 million for a film or therapy,
It's fascinating because I think this is one of those films where we're seeing like the knock-on impact of COVID, because when Spielberg makes a film, it's like a general going into battle. He's got all these people around him. And then he got sent home for however many months. And you're sent home and you've got nothing else to do but write scripts. And it gets very introspective. And we all thought we were going to die. And you then start thinking about your life. So we've had a series of films. I think Sam Mendes did Empire of Light as well on a similar theme, talking about his early life and his love for cinema. So we've seen this kind of shuffle through of just like really personal works from really big budget directors, and it's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's weird how COVID has had a big knock-on effect for cinema, but actually not a lot of cinema really talks about it. Weirdly bizarre.
Yeah, definitely. Now it's time for Julia's Facts.
Yeah, I have a few.
Awesome.
This is my favorite part of the podcast, is researching and getting into this. And one thing that I was kind of weird. So, when the family are eating, they are always eating on like disposable plates and like disposable cutlery and stuff.
Yeah.
And I think there's like a throwaway line in the film about kind of preserving Mitzi's hands for piano. But I did read something about wondering whether this is actually a get around for certain kosher rules. So there's a thing in kosher where you have to keep meat and dairy separate.
Right.
So to use utensils, you would have to have silverware for meat and silverware for dairy, and therefore 2 sets of everything. I think I did see a woman on TikTok who is very strictly kosher, and she even had like 2 sinks. One sink was for one sort of set of foods and the other sink was for the other set of foods. So by having everything be disposable, you can just have a handy get around that also like saves time on washing up. So I think I might try that out for the next time I cook dinner and save my fiance a lot of washing up to do.
Yeah, love it.
We know that John Williams obviously did the score for this film, and the Oscar nomination that he got for this score actually made him the first person to have an Oscar nomination in 7 consecutive decades? John Williams.
John Williams, though.
John Williams, I
Do you
love
know what I
him.
mean? Like, we're absolutely spoiled when it comes to composers, you know? Spielberg keeps referring to him as Johnny Williams. And this is the funny thing. If you find a composer that you can work with, you grab onto them and hold onto them for dear life. I remember, like, Hans Zimmer's like that with Denis Villeneuve and Dune, the rest of it.
Yeah.
I've got a friend, Rick, who has composed most of the music to pretty much everything I've done since 2005. You know, I mean, his work is on this podcast. He did the opening music. He did the music that ends every episode is actually called Chasing Mopeds. And the reason why that was that we were doing a short film back in 2011, a 48-hour film project, and I said, I need something that's like, it's a bit like Chasing Cars by Snow Patrol, but like a bit more upbeat. So he gave me this thing called Chasing Mopeds.
Amazing.
Rick's skill isn't just the fact that he's an amazing musician. It's the fact that he can take the mess that's in my brain and be like, okay, I've got it. You know, because I don't have the vocabulary to talk musically or anything like that. So I'm just... make that bit longer and make that bit shorter, and this bit I want it to go whoosh, woo, at this point. And he goes, got it. You find a composer who understands you and you hang on to them for dear life, you know?
Oh yeah. Some of the jewelry that Michelle Williams, who plays Mitzi, wears in the movie is some of Spielberg's mother's actual jewelry.
Oh really?
Including I can't remember which scene, but I think there's a charm bracelet that she wears that has pictures of all the kids in it. But that one is a Spielberg original, which is really cool. Obviously, David Lynch has a pretty show-stealing cameo in this film. And his only requirement for what I imagine he got paid, or maybe he didn't, but his only requirement apparently was a big bag of Cheetos. He's obsessed with Cheetos. Quote, because once you start, you need to have a lot before you can slow down and actually stop. And that spoke to my soul. That a man such as David Lynch can have snackcidents the same way that I have snackcidents and demolish almost an entire kind of Pringles in about 10 minutes.
This reminds me of like Brad Pitt had a cameo in Deadpool 2. He did it for free, and the only request was that Ryan personally brought him a coffee. You know, that was
wow.
That scene with, I think it's John Ford at like towards the end of the movie, where he talks about the horizon, like if it's up, it's interesting. If it's down, if it's interesting. If it's in the middle, it's not interesting. That's so weird. It had to have happened.
Yes, I think Seth Rogen mentioned that often he would ask, like, did this actually happen? And Spielberg would usually go, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so much of it is just you couldn't make it up.
And the last shot is one of my favourite shots because he's walking off.
Yeah.
He's happy, and then there's a horizon in the middle of the shot, and then the camera just jerkily gets pulled up so that the horizon is.
I did love that little fourth wall break. That did make me smile.
It's so like shonkily done.
Yeah,
it's like someone's going, "Oh crap!" You know, one of my favourite scenes in the film. I've got a lot of favourite scenes in it because it's a weird one. I almost like it in spite of myself. And there's the scene where he's been accosted by the bully who's given him such a hard time, and he's made him look like an absolute hero, like an absolute prince among men, and the bully's really mad at him for it. And it's fascinating because psychologically you're trying to work out what's going on in his head, and I think it's the idea that he's been made to look like an absolute god on this film, and he knows that he can't live up to it in real life.
That actually happened. Maybe not quite like that, but the way Spielberg recounts it, that this kid basically confronted him and went, "Why did you do that?" and then ran off crying.
Oh yeah, it had to be real.
Yeah.
That is so freaking bizarre, but it speaks to something. And as a filmmaker, I love making a montage. Anything where I don't have to worry about the sound and I don't have to worry about continuity, and I can just make a piece of like film just kind of sing based on the juxtaposition of the shots. Like, did they still have a rostrum montage when you were in?
So my first through third year, I think we definitely had a montage. Since COVID, the montage kind of stopped being. But I did tell Corinne Rostra about montages. So hopefully the montage will be resurrected from the ashes.
So the first ever montage was rostrum montage was done in 2004, and it was done by me. I did the first three, and the way you can make people feel 10 feet tall by the way you show them, or the way if somebody's crossed, you can make them look like a dumbass, you know, and you see him do both things. And the interesting thing is that what Sammy does is he makes him look good, not because he's trying to get in his good books or he's trying to make him feel guilty. That was literally the best story you could tell in that scene, and he went for it. He went where the story took him, and I love that, and I could really relate to that. And my favorite bit about it was when he says, "It's okay, Logan, I'm not going to tell anyone. I'm certainly not going to make a film about it," you know. It's practically a wink to the camera at that point, you know.
Yeah, there were some really like artfully done little fourth wall breaks there that were really cool. I was reading a Time magazine article. This isn't necessarily related to the Fabelmans, but I read it and it kind of broke my brain a little bit. But from this Time magazine article, so film has been around for about 130 years, give or take.
Yeah.
Spielberg's career has covered more than a third of that and counting. How wild is that?
That's insane.
Like, to account for over a third of the entire history of film and moving media. My last little tidbit of fact is obviously Sam in the film uses a lot of cameras, but the 8 and the camera props used in the film were actually functional. So some of the footage that Gabrielle LaBelle, who plays Sam, actually caught on set, they then used it when we saw the completed films, which are actually some of my favourite scenes. I think the very first one with is it Gunsmoke, the Western that he shows to the Boy Scouts, that was probably my favourite scene.
Yeah.
Just when you've made something for your friends and with your friends and like you show it to them. Yeah. It's just really nice. Like, it's very nerdy and very sad, but myself and also like a few of my fellow tabletop role players, I've made like intro videos for like our campaign. So with like title cards and it'd be, you know, so-and-so as, do you know what I mean? When I was able to make a title sequence for my D&D group and they all went, oh my God, this is really cool. This is like, it gives you the warm fuzzies. It makes you feel really good. And it's a little piece of media that you then got kind of forever to sort of commemorate.
This is part of the reason why I love film. For me, there's always the trade-off between film and theatre, right? So you know what it's like when you're in a role that you're just born to play and everybody's bringing their A game in this thing, and there's points where you've got the audience in the palm of your hand and you can make them laugh with just a gesture or a facial expression, you know? And then there's a curtain call and you're stood there and they're all applauding you, and there's like that absolute dopamine hit is phenomenal. But then it's gone, you know. There's this whole massive chunk of your life and then it's gone, and if you're lucky the most you've got is like a signed poster for it. One of the big appeals to me has always been, if I make a film, I can kind of put it on the shelf and bring it down like years later. It's always there, it'll always exist. There was a funny thing recently, when my Hope Is Born poem, one of my Christmas ones, apparently they started showing it in my mum's church. Absolutely nothing to do with me. I've never, you know, they're like, and hey, there's a really interesting thought on this. And then my mum's like, that's my kid, you know? My speaking and listening tips video that was shown in my cousin's class in Oxford, and he was like, that's my cousin, you know? So...
Oh, wow. Fabulous. Look at you getting out. I bet your mum's got like extra bragging rights at like church though.
Yeah.
Just a little edge over the other mums.
Yeah. What I found was, because she'd went to see so many rostra plays in JP Hall before there was any kind of insulation or anything like that.
JP had insulation.
So you usually just freeze to death or stuff like that, you know? It was a bit miserable, always a bit whatever. When I started putting on my own plays in Manchester, I'd make it so that when she got in at the door, she had complimentary tickets. The front of house manager would say, "You Miss Smith, hang on, bear with me one sec," and she'd come out with like flowers for her.
Oh, that's
And there'd
lovely.
be like a dedicated person, like in a shiny ball gown, who'd sort of take her up for her complimentary drinks, and then take her to a seat with her name on and all the rest of it. And
Oh, that's so
I
nice.
knew for a fact my mum would not remember a single line of the Shakespeare play that I'm putting on, and it wouldn't mean anything to her, but she'd know how it made her feel being treated like a VIP, and that was my way of thanking her for coming to see me in everything I've done, no matter how shonky it's been.
At the time of recording this, Mother's Day is coming up, folks. So Giles is setting the bar. This is your standard. Take your mum to the theatre and treat her like the absolute queen that she is.
Absolutely.
That's all my facts. I'm facted
Fantastic.
out.
Thank you so much. I did have one fact. Did you know that one time Spielberg took his dad Arnold to meet Bill Gates, and
I did not know this.
Bill Gates absolutely fanboyed out over meeting Arnold Spielberg, because Arnold invented the 235, which Gates gave him the credits in with giving him the idea for Windows. And I love this image of Spielberg, who is like a big name on campus around the planet, and you take him to meet Bill Gates and he's like, "Yeah, get out of the way, let's I want to chat with your dad," Fantastic.
Wow.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julia. They really made me smile, and we've definitely gone off on some tangents today.
Hi guys, it's Claire. Just popping in to say you should definitely check out our Patreon page. If you head to www.patreon.com/godinfilmpodcast, you'll find loads of bonus content such as extended interviews, extra little bits that didn't quite make it into the episode, as well as exclusive patrons-only episodes, like our God in Gaming episode. Plus, if you sign up to our Bishop Waller-Bridge tier, you'll get to hear episodes in advance, like our episode on Under the Banner of Heaven right now. So why not give it a try? And if that's not doable, did you know you can help the podcast for free by writing us a review, giving us a shout out on social media, or just telling a friend about us? And now, back to the show.
So, this is a bit of an unusual one. It's going to be a fairly weighty topic that we look at, and I can promise you guys we are never flipping looking at this topic again. But we are going to be looking at divorce today. We have a listener who had some thoughts that she'd like to share on it. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Lucy Hayes. I know Giles from way back when we were at university. He was one of the terrible influences who drew everyone into Am Drown.
And I apologise for nothing. I do it again, I tell you. Lucy, thank you so much for coming on the show. It has been a hot minute since I saw you last. I think you approached me about talking about this particular film, didn't you?
I did. So I listened to most of your episodes. I like to consider myself the number one fan. I'm sure that's what tested though. But I listened with huge interest to your episode about sexuality and homosexuality. And
wow.
Yeah. And in that you touched on some scripture, I'm going to call it because I don't know the right terminology always, where you were saying actually this bit isn't so much about homosexuality. People misuse it in this way. It might be more about family. It might be more about divorce. And you mentioned at that point wanting to talk about divorce at some point. And I thought, well, I am divorced. I could help with it.
That's my thing. I know all about that. Okay, fab. Okay, we'll get to that in a second. First of all, do you want to tell us a little bit about the Fabelmans and why this film linked in with this particular topic for you?
So the Fabelmans it's a beautiful film, really about family and about different types of love and about that trope which I kind of really love in films, about the mismatched couple who try and stay together. And there's so much good in there, but they're also missing big bits of each other. There's a lot to like about this film. There's an amazing cast, and I think particularly the child actors kind of blow you away when you step away and sort of think, wow, the subtlety and the nuance that they're bringing to all of that. But it's really beautiful as well. I think I perhaps have like associated Spielberg with more blockbuster type films.
More genre-y stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Whereas this is really slow and gentle and beautiful. I like the way that the relationship aspect between the parents, the divorce aspect is handled in this. I think it avoids many of the pitfalls or cliches or stereotypes that you see in other films. And it manages to do that despite being set in the 50s and 60s.
It doesn't demonize anybody, does it?
No,
I thought
there's
that
none
was...
of that. There's no simple answers or magic wand moments either. It feels very human.
Yeah, very much so. So the thing I've been thinking about is, why do you think Spielberg chose to fictionalize this story rather than just tell a straight biopic? Why is it the Fabelmans and not the Spielbergs?
I imagine that he wanted to tell it in this way because to tell a biopic about something which presumably impacted his childhood and impacted his family so much would feel really personal, maybe a bit close to the bone. But also perhaps he wanted to tell a more general story of how these things come about and how it isn't just someone did something wrong and then such and such happens, but the kind of how deeply entwined you are as a couple and how you negotiate getting through that. And I think he also does a very delicate and by and large quite good job with the children's perspective of it. I think before I watched the film, I was a little bit worried this was going to be yet another one of these films with an overly wise child who takes these clueless adults through something, and he doesn't do that. You don't want that in a film about adult relationships and breaking and all that sort of thing. So I presume it allowed him to have a bit more artistic distance and to perhaps change some things and maybe change some things to the way he would have liked them to be rather than the way they were.
I think there's some truth to that. I think also with any kind of adaptation that you're doing, you're going to have to take some creative liberties. You're going to have to compress this timeline or move things around. And if it's a piece of fiction inspired by your life, well, you can say, well, this is how I remembered it. This is how it felt to me, without having it. You can't then have anybody come back at you and say, oh, no, actually, I think you'll find you went to this high school on this date. And in fact, and so in a way, I think by making it a fictional film, it's more honest. Does that make sense? It's a bit more like showing you're working out.
Yeah, I think that's really true.
What do you think this film does tell us about divorce?
So the thing I like about this is how complicated it is. I think there's this idea that when you get divorced, it's because somebody did one thing wrong and that exploded everything. And I think in my experience and in kind of experience the couple of friends I have who've been through similarly, sometimes it is like that.
Yeah.
Actually, more often, it's not about right and wrong. It's about what you can work through and what works for you as a couple. And some people, terrible things can happen and they can work through those things, which from the outside you might think, well, that's completely intolerable. And for other people, so with my divorce, it came as a huge shock to everybody. And I did a lot of supporting other people through.
You're okay. You're going to get through this.
Yeah. Supporting them through the concept of me getting divorced.
Who took it the hardest, if you don't mind me asking, out of the people that weren't you and your ex-husband?
So interestingly, because I knew that there would be people who would take it hard, and it was a long time coming. Like Tim and I did an awful lot of work to stay together. So we were probably working towards or trying not to work towards getting divorced for maybe 2 or 3 years. Wow. We did all of the couples counselling and the long conversations and the trying, to give each other more space and all of that sort of thing. And I think we split in January 2021. So in the autumn before that, I actually started intentionally having conversations with family and friends about things aren't completely all right between me and Tim, and almost sort of warming them up to the...
Laying the groundwork.
Yeah. But despite that, I mean, my mum took it the hardest. It didn't help that it was January 2021. We were in lockdown, so I had to stand on her doorstep and say, me and Tim are splitting up. My family on both sides are Catholic, and whilst my parents aren't particularly practicing anymore, the cultural aspects run quite deep.
Yeah, it doesn't just go away, does it?
No, it doesn't just disappear at all. And whilst my uncle had got divorced quite a few years earlier, he was the first person ever in our family to have done that. And I think it just didn't sit with her as what she thought my life should look like.
It didn't exactly sit with what you thought your life should look like. Nope.
No. Exactly.
Nobody sort of goes into this sort of thinking, this is what we're going to do, you know?
Yeah. Nobody gets married and thinks, oh, I'll give it 5-10 years, see how it goes. Everyone does it thinking it's going to be forever. So she took it very hard. She didn't speak to me for a little while afterwards, but my dad did, and like he sort of mediated us the way through. And then she found it very hard to talk about for quite a long time. She doesn't particularly like talking about it now. So, but you know, is accepting, and I think in our case, like in the Fabelmans, everybody has kind of put the kids first, and that's and also because me and Tim are so very amicable. I think we've had the world's most amicable divorce. I think that makes it easier for people in a way, but it does make it harder for people to understand, like, why didn't you just stay together? You get along so well.
Are there any particular sort of myths that you think about that there are about getting divorced over here that you want to attack?
Firstly, it's not quick getting divorced.
No.
I think in TV and film, it's always this, something happens, you decide to split up, you immediately split up, you immediately stop living together, and then you're divorced a very short while later.
Yeah.
It doesn't work like that in reality. So even once Tim and I split, we lived together for another 5 months before I moved out.
Yeah.
That's really common. Like, most people do not have the money to immediately go and live somewhere else. And equally, even if they can go and live with family or friends or whatever for a bit, you've got so much upheaval in your life, you don't necessarily want to leave your home as well, even if it's difficult. The other thing, but this has changed in the last year or so, people used to think you could get a divorce for unreconcilable differences. Now, I don't know if that is an American thing and it happens over there. It wasn't a criteria over here. So at the point at which Tim and I split, you could basically get a divorce for adultery and abandonment and things like that. But if no one had done anything wrong, you were waiting it out. So you could have a divorce having been separated for 2 years with consent or 5 years without. That's changed now. So they brought in new no blame divorce rules. But even though it's still not fast. So you apply, there's a 6-month cooling off period, and then the legal process takes its own time. So while we split in January 2021, my divorce came through in the spring this year. Oh, wow. So, yeah, it's not a quick thing. And I think the other thing is that the finance stuff all rolls along pretty much separately. So you can get divorced having not sorted out your finances at all. Right. And there's no sort of limitation on that. So no. And that's a more complicated bit, I think, for most people. And I think that is also the bit where things start getting not amicable for a lot of people.
Yeah, I'm not divorced myself, but I've had front row seats to at least one. And from what I saw, all the big ticket stuff gets sorted pretty quickly because it has to, you know, you keep your pension and I'll have the house, that sort of thing gets taken care of. And then it breaks down to tiny little things like, well, we set up this policy back in 1984, and it then can end up being punitive little things. I appreciate you've said you've probably had the most amicable divorce you possibly could. The divorce I saw up close was nothing like that in the slightest. So then so much of it just becomes about setting out to hurt the other person, which, if you have kids, doesn't really do them any favors, you know?
You have to think very carefully about what is important to you, what is worth dying on a hill about, and what the impact of doing that is going to have. It was important to me to not stay living together indefinitely. So I made a set of financial decisions, which meant he could buy me out a bit of the house. And then I would take it on trust that he would then sell the house for a certain amount of time and buy me out the rest. Yeah. No lawyer would advise you to do that. And you do need a very trusting relationship and some safeguards. You know, we were intertwined with each other's family. So I would just go and tell on him to his mum. Yeah. But you can't be amicable on your own. I think that's the thing I've also seen from other people's relationships, that you can try really hard, but if the other person is intent on being punitive or not talking, it gets difficult.
Yeah, the phrase that always sticks in my head is, you can only be responsible for 50% of a relationship, you know?
Yeah.
Did you have any experience with, like, how the church treated you with your divorce, or has that not been?
So I think it was mainly through extended family. So the Catholic Church obviously does not like divorce in any way, shape or form. while we did go to church when I was a child, I haven't been a practicing Catholic in my adult life, and I would now consider myself to be an atheist, having sort of moved from Catholic to lapsed Catholic to agnostic,
Yeah.
the sort of atheist over the last almost 40 years. And I think with other people's experiences and with what sort of gets translated back to you, there's a lot of, people praying for you and praying for you to stay together, and it's just a bit incompatible with the Catholic Church. And I don't know what they do about that, because Catholicism in the UK is not attracting lots of new people into it. And
I think because of the not recognising divorce, they tie themselves in knots about it. Do you remember Boris Johnson's recent marriage to Carrie Simmons?
Yeah.
I think his other marriages were annulled through the Catholic Church. And how bloody rude can you be? Do you know what I mean? Like, to say, okay, this thing didn't work out and that sucks, but because obviously you married Boris, what were you expecting? But to say all of that relationship, all of the children that sort of came from that relationship and everything, oh, well, it doesn't really count.
Yeah.
Blows my mind, that.
Yeah. I mean, they absolutely tie themselves in knots with it, and you end up with ridiculous things like that, where you find some mealy-mouthed way to say those things don't count, so you can do what you want now.
Yeah.
But equally, to my great aunt, when she got married, she got married for the time later, so in her 30s. Who could have done such a thing? I know.
Heavens preserve us.
Yes. And to an older man who was divorced. And
Right.
The Catholic Church at that point just said absolutely no. So they couldn't get married in church, despite her being, a lifelong Catholic, went to church every week, was very active in the Catholic community, all of that.
Yeah.
Can't get married in the church.
Yeah. Yeah, blows my mind. That makes no sense at all. Listen, Lucy, I could talk to you about this all day, I think, and I will at some occasion. In the meantime, thank you so much for talking to us about this, about a really personal subject today. I can't tell you how much we appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome.
So, Julia, that was Lucy. What did you think?
It's nice to know we've got one fan, we've got one listener, but yeah, just big thank you and props to Lucy, because that is, to discuss your own divorce, I think for a public forum, that takes a lot of guts. So yeah, that's much appreciated from me.
Yeah, it's some really heavy stuff, and I think one thing she really brought out was just the banality of divorce and how long and drawn out it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's
as you said, it's not, click your fingers and it's done. There's, I imagine, a lot of paperwork there that you've got to sift through.
Yeah. And I think one of the things it had in common with the Fabelmans was there's no real villains. Do you know what I mean? There's no kind of moustache twirling bad guys in it. There are people who make some bad choices, but that doesn't make them bad people. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think for some it could be quite easy to sort of blame Mitzi and kind of go, oh well, she was in love with Benny and this, that and the other, but actually there's so much more to it than that, and I'm kind of glad that they didn't kind of pin it on the slightly eccentric and also struggling with their mental health woman as the villain of the piece, it was refreshing to see how mental health kind of touched on and depicted, not as this weird thing that kind of made her irrational and do all these, irrational things, if that makes sense. It was very sensitively and very well done, I think.
I think like you're seeing somebody who was kind of trapped in a particular situation and who just didn't know how to get themselves out, and anything they were doing was starting to make it worse, So
I think Mitzi is very much, I don't think a marriage to anybody would have been good for her in the end, because I think she's somebody who constantly needs to adapt and change and move around in order to kind of be who she is. And I think she struggles when you kind of put names and roots and boxes and labels on things, is when she starts to feel kind of trapped and not herself anymore. She's a very interesting character.
Definitely. I love the fact that Michelle Williams, one of her first kind of big jobs in the industry was being on Dawson's Creek, and being a Dawson's Creek diehard fan. there is no other kind of Dawson's Creek fan thinking about we're all diehards. I love the fact that she's gone from being the love interest of Dawson, who is like a Spielberg nut, to graduating to playing Spielberg's mother, basically.
Yeah, it's a very kind of full circle sort of story, really, isn't it?
Interesting trajectory, you know. Now it's time for finding their faith in the film. So we are going to talk about some sort of hefty topics on this one, so sort of strap in. But
grab a cuppa.
First, get a cuppa, get yourself comfy. But first of all, we are going to talk about horny teens and spirituality.
Yes.
Because one of the things that got me was the depiction of Sammy's relationship with his first girlfriend, Monica, who was played by Chloe Monet East. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And that bit where Monica's like a devout evangelical Christian. Do you remember you go into the bedroom?
Yeah. I don't know if you get this, but sometimes I get such intense, like, secondhand embarrassment sometimes. So when she's there, praying for Jesus to, to enter Sam and all of that, it was just wild to me.
Yeah. So do you remember how in the June episode we talked about how when politics and religion travel in the same car, they don't see the cliff they're going over? That sort of thing. So when religion and desperately wanting to get off with somebody travel in the same car, you absolutely have no idea what you're flipping doing, So there's the memorable scene where we get to her bedroom and she gets for Sammy to pray for Jesus to come into her heart as a precursor to them making out, which is delightfully awkward. And I think, to be honest with you, it may be all too familiar to those of us who found faith in our teens and were frequently torn between the desire to follow Jesus and the desire to get off with another hormonal teenage time bomb, So, if we have any teenage fans, any teenage listeners, how can I put it? You can't convert someone and get off with them at the same time. It just doesn't work,
Yeah. Also, maybe don't try and convert somebody without their consent.
Oh, Sammy is consenting like nobody's business. Do you know what I mean?
When I was watching it, for me, it felt very I'm not trying to erase his Jewishness, which I think for me, kind of watching on behalf of Sammy, I was quite that's not okay. But then I think, he's also I get making out of it, so sure,
There's a pretty girl in the equation, Julia. You've never had to be a teenage boy. It's so loud in your brain. Do you know what I mean? You want to get off with somebody so badly. I can definitely sympathise with him on that subject. Okay. Strap in, guys. We're going to look at divorce in the Bible, and this is the first and last time we ever look at this nonsense again, okay? So, this is a really tricky subject, and first of all, I'd say please don't mistake what I'm saying here as any kind of spiritual guidance. A podcast cannot be your pastor. And there's a quote from a guy called Tim Keller, and you won't have heard of Tim Keller. In the evangelical Christian kind of world, he was a big name on campus. Do you know what I mean? He was such a G. And he has this line about if your God never disagrees with you, you might just be worshipping an idealized version of yourself. And
that's interesting.
And I think this was a particular key thing for me because I felt like my views on divorce were somewhat different to what's present in the Gospels. And this was my attempt to kind of unpack that and just try and pick away at something. It's a bit like, this is what I believe. Why do I believe that? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So before we go any further, I think it's we need to work out why marriage is so important in Christianity. And essentially, the idea is that a marriage is like a symbol for Christ's relationship with the church. So going even further back, marriage is a metaphor that gets used to describe God's relationship with Israel. And then it's obviously got those values and principles in it that are like loyalty, fidelity, and crucially love. And I think we could agree that those are still principles that we see in modern marriages, or I certainly hope so, On a personal level for me, my striving to have a good marriage is something I do, like, not just to honour Claire, but also to honour God.
Yeah.
Long before you met me, I was a celibate Christian for a long time, right? And it was the easiest way to sort of point to something and be like, yes, my faith means something to me because I'm willing to give up this massive thing in order to follow it. And I was worried sometimes when I got married and when you didn't have that delineation anymore, how are people going to be able to look at me and be like, oh, well, Giles is obviously a Christian. And my thing for this is just, my plan so far is I'm just going to go hard on the marriage thing. I'm going to be like the best husband and best dad I can be. And that's the plan. And they can tell me whether I succeeded or failed on that one later on. But that's what I'm aiming for. Do you know what I mean? You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's get to this. What did Jesus say and why is it a problem for Giles? So there's this one section, Matthew 19, verse 1 to 9. I'll read out to you. When Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea to the other side of Jordan. Large crowds followed him and he healed them there. Some Pharisees came to him to test him. Now, do you remember what I said about Pharisees? They are like the...
We don't like them. We don't sit with them at lunch. If I remember rightly, they're always like, "Oh, well, Jesus, if you're really the Son of God, like, do this."
Actually,
oh, Jesus.
I think you'll find, you know.
But
I'm
we
just
don't sit with
asking
them.
a genuine question. They are those kind of guys, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Pharisees are the internet comment section in big silly hats, you know.
Oh Lord.
So, some Pharisees came to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" And then Jesus goes, "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery." Oh, okay. So that is a big deal for me and for a lot of other people because it only permits one possible exception for divorce, you know? And the reason why that's a problem is that it makes no reference to domestic violence, sexual abuse, financial abuse, neglect, coercive control, or any other possible kind of divorce. And for me, the image I always had in my mind was that if a wife came at me with a weapon, that would be a much more reasonable excuse for getting divorced than infidelity.
Yeah, absolutely.
If Claire comes at me with an iron, that's a much better excuse for getting divorced rather than I get off with Henry Cavill at the toilets at BAFTA, you know?
Oh, you lucky thing, you.
Because, you know, like, it's Henry Cavill. If it wasn't going to be him...
I mean, if Dan came home and was like, "Oh, okay, I've got something to tell you. I made out with Henry Cavill," I'd be like, "I forgive you." Like, who am I to judge that?
Yeah.
Who am I to, stop what could be a beautiful union?
I'm just glad you got that out of your system, darling.
Yeah.
You know?
At least you were honest with me. You could have kept that a secret. Communication is very important.
So now we have this problem because suddenly myself and anyone who agrees with me on this idea about abuse being a more important reason than adultery, now I'm in this situation where I'm more open and merciful than Jesus. And I know that this is absolutely not the case. Don't get me wrong, Giles, great bunch of lads, not as great as the Son of God. Something's not right there. So with that in mind, it's clear to me that this scripture can't just be read on a superficial level. So let's try and dig into this some more and see if we can unearth a bit of context. And I knew you'd like this bit because we are going to be talking about context in the sort of Roman world from 50 BC to 30 AD.
That's my jam.
I know, right?
The Roman Empire is my Roman Empire.
I know. Late Roman Republic. Hello. Yes. Early Roman. Yeah. Okay. I'm down with this. Okay. So in the Roman world, lawful divorce was relatively informal. Basically, the wife took her dowry back and just left the husband's house. Roman men had always held the right to divorce their wives, and a patriarch could order the divorce of any couple under his authority. So by the time of Julius Caesar, divorce is relatively common and pretty sort of shame-free. It's like subject of gossip rather than any major social disgrace.
Yeah.
Okay, do you want to know some of the reasons a man could divorce his wife?
Hit me with it.
There's the biggies like infertility, adultery. Then there's drunkenness or making copies of the household keys, which I love that. That's such a weird little thing, you know? So
I feel like there's a story there.
There's a story there.
Like, those kind of rules don't get made with like something big going down, but then the rule having to be then put in place. So I want to know who's copying keys and what came of that.
Exactly. Divorce by either party severed the lawful family alliance that had been formed through marriage, and remarriage might create an entirely new set of economically or politically beneficial partnerships. Among the elite, husbands and wives might remarry several times, and there's no public record kept of the proceedings, and official registration of divorce wasn't required until 449 AD. So, like, with Roman influence starting to drift into Jewish society, you can see it why it might be a bit of a talking point. And then if we go back even further by about like 1300 years when Moses was writing Deuteronomy, a man could divorce his wife for any reason and kick her out of the home. Then, even if she went off and started a new life, the first husband could, whenever he felt like, simply swing by and legally take her back. So weirdly...
Yeah, I don't think I like that very much.
No, I don't think you would, you know?
But there's no kind of woman divorce her husband.
Okay, I did a little bit of research into like Jewish divorce. It was called a certificate, it's called a get. So it's spelled like G-E-T, but sounds like gat. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And I think the man was the only one who could write the gat, even if it was the wife requesting the divorce. So I'm not saying it was completely, absolutely out of possibility, but you still needed the man there to go through the thing. So weirdly, this thing of writing a woman a certificate, at that time, that is a kindness to women because it means they have like proof of a legal separation.
Yeah.
In ancient Israel, at the time of Jesus, there's these two schools of thought amongst like Jewish scholarship. So there's the House of Hillel, and they have more liberal views, and the House of Shammai, who have the more conservative views, right? Okay. Now they have disagreements on everything. For example, like white lies, whether it is morally permissible to tell an ugly bride that she looks beautiful, you know? The House of Shammai said it was wrong to lie, but Hillel said that all brides are beautiful on their wedding day, you know? So like, you could... I get the impression with these guys, like, whichever one said one thing, the other one would say the opposite, just out of pure spite. Do you know what I mean? You know? And when it came to what we're talking about here, Shammai held that any man may only divorce his wife for a serious transgression, but Hillel allowed divorce for even trivial offences, so like burning a meal, you know?
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
So
that's bad news for me.
So this kind of gives you an idea of the conversations they're having, and a new Messiah comes along, and the Pharisees are basically trying to figure out which camp he falls into. You know, are you like a vote leave or a vote remain kind of guy? You know, it's that sort of vibe, you know?
Yeah.
And then Jesus comes up with something that the House of Shammai... It's even more strict than what the House of Shammai are saying. He talks about the adultery thing, you know? So he's taken it from a serious reason to just this reason. So on the surface, it sounds like he's even more conservative. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know? But one thing I wanted to talk about was Jesus and exceptions, and just like exceptions in everyday speech, really, you know? And there's unspoken exceptions that occur like all the time. So if you told a student, be careful not to press the fire alarm or you'll be in trouble, they would understand that you're saying don't press it unless there's an actual fire, you know?
Yeah.
If 2,000 years from now, people were taking a literalist view saying pressing the fire alarm under any circumstances is a grave sin, according to Julia, we'd see that as like totally ridiculous, you know?
Yeah.
And similarly, Jesus says things that are contradictory in parts. At one point, he quotes the Ten Commandments about the honor your father and mother, you know? But at another point, I can't remember the verse, he says, if anybody doesn't sort of turn their back on their mother and father and their wives and their children and their jobs and whatever to follow me, then there's no point, you know? So we've gone from honor your father and mother to, they can get stuffed, you know? It's dependent on the context. And I was thinking about this. So one particular example I wanted to look at, it comes from Mark 2:23. So out of all the Gospels, right, Mark is the first one. And it's the one that's like, all right, shut up, losers. This is how it went down. It is the shortest. It is the punchiest. It is the most to the point, you know? And this one goes a bit like this. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, have you never read what David did? When he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any man but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is a nickname that Jesus has for himself, is Lord even of the Sabbath, okay? So that's a lot of info to throw at you. So let me see if I can break that down a bit, you know? So Jesus is talking about his ancestor, David, who is literally on the run from the king at this time. The king...
Is this the same David and Goliath, David?
Yeah, okay.
Yes, okay.
So how can I put it? David starts off as a really pure, spiritual, good guy, and then over time, power and riches and luxury kind of corrupt him until the point where he is dodgy AF, you know? He's like, yeah. So at the time that we're talking about David, at this point in his life, he's still quite a young man. He's still a good guy. And David's, how can I put it? He's a funny one. Like I say, he makes some incredibly sketchy choices, but he does repent afterwards, and he is kind of reconciled with God towards the end of his life. But we're looking at the younger, much less complicated David at this point, right? He's on the run from the king. If the king catches him, he will kill him. And it is purely because the king is jealous, you know? David is young and sort of popular and an amazing musician and a skilled fighter, and the king is like, okay. And to give you this idea, this presence bread, it is absolutely forbidden to eat this bread, you know?
Is this like what Catholics might consider like communion bread?
No.
Is it the same, or is it they're different?
It goes even beyond that, because communion bread, you give out to everybody. So it's along the same lines, I think, of like giving a sacrifice, and you'd make you'd have like 2 piles of bread in like 6 loaves on each pile, right? And they're like
offerings?
Yeah, basically. And they wouldn't be touched. They'd be there all week, and you wouldn't touch them. The only people who would be able to eat them after the end of the week would be the priest, right? So if you imagine that we've got such a ritualized society at this point, it's really, it's like stealing from God, basically, you know? Yeah. But David did it, you know? He's like, I am starving. My men are starving. If we don't eat this food, we're not going to have enough energy to flee, and we're going to die, you know? Yeah. And then the priest is like, oh, yeah, just eat the damn bread. Do you know what I mean? You know? And interestingly, Jesus tells this story, and Jesus is cool with it, Now, it would be a mistake to think that God endorses everything that happens in the Bible, you know? That's why we try to think more in terms of like what's Christ-like rather than what's biblical, because there is a lot of stuff that's biblical that is not cool by any standards. But this thing, Jesus, like, it's fine, you know? And the people who are giving him a hard time, they're plucking grain from the grain fields and just eating it. This was a process that poor people would do. You'd collect the grain, and obviously there'd be bits left over, and you deliberately wouldn't collect them so like widows and orphans could come and sort of eat them themselves. Do you know what I mean? You know, and the disciples are eating some of these because, I don't know, they flipping walked everywhere. They were probably starving. And some, again, Pharisees, the internet's comment section are going, oh, I see he's letting his boys eat grain on a Sabbath. And the idea is plucking food, like harvesting something, is work.
Yeah.
And you shouldn't do any work
It's
whatsoever.
a very, like,
do you know what I mean?
holy thing that they're trying to catch them out on.
Yeah. And, like, 2,000 years later, we can be like, okay, that's kind of dumb, you know? It seems like a sort of waste of time, but why are you making such a big deal over that, you know? But this points to me that Jesus, and I have to be very careful how I say this, Jesus is okay with you breaking the rules if it saves a life, you know?
Yeah, I think sometimes just because it is legal does not mean that it's always the best thing to do.
Yeah.
You look at, certain times and places in history where, things like segregation in America was legal.
Yeah.
It was the law, but it's not right.
Yeah.
So, it's okay. And I just, doesn't he say stuff about it's okay to break like the laws of the land if like, I'm sure he talk at some point about obeying the laws of the land that you're in or something, or am I horribly misremembering?
So I think we talked about this before about like getting, pay your taxes basically, you know? And it is a thing of like obey the laws of the land unless they vastly contradict, goodness and morality, for want of a better phrase. And this is obviously the contentious issue that we see happening over again, because one person's definition of a law that's immoral and others is very different,
Yeah.
So working on this basis that Jesus doesn't mind rules being broken if it saves a life, it seems reasonable that if you are in a marriage that poses serious danger to you, Jesus wants you to get out, And for me, that would cover any kind of abuse, again, like physical, sexual, financial neglect, anything like that. There's that line he says, if the Sabbath is made for man, not man made for the Sabbath, then for me it stands to reason that marriage is made for man, not man made for marriage. I said man to mean like mankind. It just flows better. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I mean, I assume maybe from Jesus' perspective, one would assume that if you're married to somebody, that you love each other. So, the potential of being abused in a marriage, it does happen, but hopefully will never come up. And so the only rule really that you should have is infidelity.
Well, it's interesting because also like everybody's beating their wife at this point. It's entirely... Oh, let me rephrase that.
It wasn't frowned upon,
yeah,
I guess, to beat your wife.
It's entirely normalised. And the other way around, is any man going to admit to his wife being physically sort of violent with him? It's that, you're not going to do it because... So he's not really talking about that issue because there's so much to unpack society before you could even get there,
Yeah.
So what I think Jesus meant here, coming back to the original verse, and the way it makes sense to me is if we read it as Jesus answering the specific question set to him. So when they're saying, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Like, this could mean, like, she burnt the meal, or she lost her looks, or she was infertile. Basically a stupid reason,
Yeah.
So I think he's saying that anyone who divorces his wife for a stupid reason and marries somebody else is committing adultery because you are not treating your marriage the way it was intended. That's how I'm, like, interpreting
Yeah, I think that makes the most sense
at this point. And like, I went into an absolute rabbit hole on this one. I took me ages to get out of it. I seem to have a bit of a Goldilocks problem because either the teaching was too broad or it was mind-bendingly technical. So one thing,
it can be tricky, I think, when you're faced with, and something that I maybe don't, I guess it's kind of like when somebody you really idolize from like a celebrity perspective says something that could be construed as like problematic, and you're trying to understand why they've said that and if that is problematic, or if you can still like listen to their music or watch their movies and not feel bad about it. But it must be difficult to kind of come to terms with that.
Now imagine that between you and this that celebrity there is 2,000 years, an entirely different culture, and like several different language translations to factor in. You know, it's really tricky. You know.
And I mean, if it's not blasphemous to say, I mean, it's entirely possible that although we have written down that's what Jesus said, is it exactly what Jesus said? Like, you know, he could be, you know, papers these days, they'll misquote anybody, even Jesus.
Yes, I mean, you know what it's like studying ancient times probably better than me.
Yeah.
Jesus sort of dies and is resurrected and all that jazz in, let's say, 30 AD, and then the first sort of Gospels are coming around. I think if I gave the Gospel of Mark comes in around like 58, 60 AD, something like that, which in terms of like the ancient world and surviving documents, that's super quick, isn't it? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's not like so often you get people writing about people like hundreds, maybe even thousands of years, you know, down the line.
Coming back to our Arthur discussion, like I think there's references to like this 5th century chieftain, and it's being written in like the 6th century at the earliest, and then the 9th and the rest of it. So having something that's being written within living memory, you know, these books weren't written on their own and then just brought out to the world. These, like Mark, he wasn't actually there. He did his research. He asked around. He said, you know, did he definitely say this and did he definitely say that? And somebody was writing down like Jesus' sayings as much as they could. So I do hear what you're saying, and that is obviously a valid conversation about did he actually say this. I think for me, I'm going to assume that what he said was what he said until somebody proves me otherwise. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, you can kind of end up in a rabbit hole of, oh, well, if it wasn't exactly this, then he didn't really maybe say that, or he did say that. You know, it becomes a pointless exercise, I think. It's fun to entertain briefly as an academic.
Yeah. And then we get into this idea of like just making Jesus in your own image. Do you know what I mean? You know, and that's not...
Yeah.
I'm trying my best not to do that, you know? One thing I did come across was this discussion of like a valid divorce or a frivolous divorce. And to me, I just didn't think this was a debate worth getting into, because every person who is getting a divorce thinks they have a valid reason. You know, Lucy told us how long and complicated and drawn out and emotionally draining and expensive getting a divorce was. So if you tell me you've got a good reason to get divorced, I'm not going to argue with you. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know, I think the majority of people wanting a divorce probably do have a good reason. And the only people who don't are either A, too rich, or too stupid, or probably both, you know? So what we're dealing with then is people who are basically the Boris Johnsons of this world, and I really try not to waste my breath on them if I can help it, you know?
Yeah.
The last sort of thing I wanted to sort of talk about was some people made the distinction between divorce but not remarriage, and I saw some references suggesting that divorce was permissible but getting remarried weren't, and there were some arguments that suggested if you got divorced, your only options were either to be celibate for the rest of your life or to be reconciled with your spouse. And some people pointed out that to me that marriage was a covenant, not a contract. Have you ever heard about this distinction? Because this is new to me.
You might have to run me through that one.
So the distinction, as I understand it, is that in a covenant, you're meant to keep your end of the bargain even if the other person doesn't.
Oh, okay.
Now, like, I can see some of the thinking behind this. For example, if your spouse cheats on you, that's not an excuse for you to then go out and cheat on them just to get back at them. Like, that's childish. It's not honouring you. It's not honouring God. And it's just really nasty tit for tat way of approaching human relationships.
Yeah.
So I understand it in that context. But then to suggest that if you are divorced from a person, you still have obligations to that person, that just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, and especially if you're looking at a divorce because of, abuse or neglect or something else that is unconscionable.
Yeah.
Why, what you shouldn't be tied to that person by any means.
That's like cancelling your mobile phone contract and still having to send them money every month. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's
if it sounds
like paying rent.
Yeah, do it. Yeah, if it sounds ridiculous when we apply it to something as frivolous as that, then it sounds ridiculous when we apply it to something as massive as divorce. Do you know what I mean? And like, straight up, there was less evidence about remarriage being okay. You had to look for it. You had to interpret it. For me, it was 1 Corinthians 7 verse 15 that helped me do a lot of the legwork about not being bound to a person, But like, one of the key principles in marriage is that you have to be faithful to one another. And if you're saying that you still have to be faithful to this person when you're divorced, then that's not really divorce. That's just living separately. And the Bible makes it clear that divorce and separation are not the same thing. Now, some people will probably listen to this and think, well, Giles, you're just interpreting scripture to fit your own bias. And to those people, I would say, yes. Yes, I absolutely am. Anybody who has even a little bit of training at an academic level will recognise that every person brings their own biases to any text they read. And on such a contentious issue, that has the potential to affect virtually all of us.
Yeah. And I mean, you're using your bias for good. Right? Unlike others who might use this bias for evil. So, you're doing good work.
So it would be like, considering that everybody knows someone who got divorced at some point, so it would be impossible not to have some thoughts going into this. So in the interest of transparency, my bias is the belief that God is love, which is stated in 1 John 4 verse 8, I believe. And therefore, I don't believe for 1 second that a God would condemn a guiltless person to a lifetime alone because of the actions of another. That doesn't make any sense to me. One of the things that always stuck in my head is like, no matter what you do, you're only ever responsible for 50% of a relationship.
Yeah.
So you could be the best, most wonderful, sweetest, kindest, caring person, and if you're married to a narcissist, then you can't.
Yeah, you absolutely can't. No.
So I'm also sure there are people probably listening to this getting frustrated and hearing like the massive loopholes in my arguments, and they are there. But honestly, if I did try and go into that like granular level of detail, this podcast would be 3 hours long, and I'm the poor soul that has to edit this show. So if you want to hear my sources and the things I looked into, I'll put them in the episode description. There was one, www.gotquestions.org was good. BibleThinker.org had some brilliant videos that went into this in like completely unbiased, granular detail. And also lifesavingdivorce.com introduced me to the concept of like divorce ministry, which I thought was brilliant because it's not something people talk about. And it's a shame because I was talking to my line manager today about this because he talked about it in church, and he was talking about how he got divorced. And I brought up the line how usually the argument against it is, I think it's in Malachi, where it says God hates divorce. And my boss was like, yeah, do you know who else hates divorce? Divorced people. It flipping sucks. Nobody wants to do it. God hates divorce. He doesn't hate divorcees. It's like,
yes,
it's like you
I
and
think
I
that's
saying,
an important distinction.
Yeah, it's like you and I saying, I hate amputation. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Nobody wants to do this. Nobody wants this to happen. Nobody goes into this with the aim to do this. And I don't really believe anybody is going into this frivolously, you know? Yeah, so have a read of those sources, have a listen to those videos, and you can tell me what conclusions you came to.
I think that's an important part of faith, right? To reconcile and understand what those things mean to you. And I mean, I think we've talked about this previously, you know, you might slightly disagree with Jesus on certain things, and Jesus might disagree with you, but that doesn't mean that he loves you any less or that you love him any less, right?
Yeah, so the way I always thought about it is like, how can I put it? Have you ever had an argument with somebody and you know that they're right, but it still bugs the crap out of you anyway?
Yeah.
It's usually like either you sort of look into it and you ask yourself, am I reading this wrong, or is there any other way I could do it, or is there a middle ground that you can find? Do you know what I mean? Because I don't want to be worshipping a God who just agrees with me and everything I say. I think if I was doing that, God would hate all the people that I hate. Do you know what I mean? You know?
Yeah.
And the knowledge that sort of God loves the people is absolutely nuts about some of the worst people in the world, and he still thinks of them as his children. That's the thing that tells me that I haven't completely just rewired God to be whatever I need him to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
So that ends our Finding the Faith in the Film section.
Hey,
thankfully.
you did it.
I can promise you we are never going back to that one ever again. You're getting married
at some point. It's funny because my fiance's family are Catholic.
Uh-huh.
I would say, I mean, his uncle is a deacon, so they're somewhat invested, but they're not super conservative. So, for example, obviously, Dan and myself living together whilst married for some very conservative Catholics would be extremely immoral. And you know, I would be a loose woman, but Dan's family really don't mind. But obviously, I'm not religious. Dan isn't particularly religious either. So for us, we're probably not going to have a church wedding because it seems pointless is probably the wrong word, and indeed more of a harsh word than I mean. But when you're married in a church, it's because that's meaningful for you, you know, to make that promise in front of God and all of that stuff, and then two people becoming one people and all of that lovely stuff. But for me, it would seem a bit hypocritical, I suppose, you know, when I'm there for the architecture and nothing more. Because I mean, let's face it, there are some gorgeous churches up and down the country. So we're actually thinking potentially a hand fasting, because that can be tailored to sort of be, I mean, first of all, it's very fantasy coded, I'm not gonna lie. It's a little bit Game of Thrones, you know. But also it's one where those kind of weddings can be a little bit more secular, but a bit more kind of tailored to us as people and our relationship as a thing, rather than you know, attributing it to or in a promise to anything other than each other, really.
The one thing I'd say, and the one thing like evangelical Christians do really well, is that a lot of them are actually quite pragmatic about marriage a lot of the time. Some churches do not handle divorce very well, and they need to get better at it, and we need to get better at loving people. But when it comes to marriage in general, I've been on like marriage weekends, and I've been on, one thing I would highly recommend and seek out if you can find it is like pre-marriage counselling.
Yes, I was going to ask you about this because
I cannot stress this enough. It's such a good thing. Sorry, you were going to say something.
So Dan's cousin and his wife were married 3 years ago now, but his wife's family are very Catholic. So obviously a Catholic wedding was on the books. But I remember them telling me, oh yeah, so we had to have, I think it was basically sort of compulsory, like marriage interview. And at first I went, oh, well, like, oh, that's ridiculous. You know, why do they make you do that? But then as they sort of explained it, I think in a way it's sort of how the Catholic Church at least, kind of gets around some of not having a divorce thing, because once you've had that discussion, even simple things like, well, are you going to have a shared bank account or not? And who's going to do this and who's going to do that? And apparently, you know, they were at these meetings and there were other couples who were sort of getting into kind of arguments about these sorts of things. And it's like, well,
it is
clearly you're not ready to get married yet, you know?
Yeah, and it's brilliant. So we had two kind of marriage courses, basically. And one was like from our home church, Life Church. Bless them. Life Church kind of screwed it up a little bit. So we did our marriage course counselling actually after we got married, because the others we couldn't get the availability. And the other one, we had to do the marriage counselling, a prerequisite to get married in that church building. Now, it says marriage counselling. What it is, a video with like some fairly shonky production values, but what you're going to do. But what it does is it forces you to have these conversations, like shared bank accounts, like how do you handle conflict? Are you a rhino or a hedgehog? You know, do you just charge straight into a conflict, or do you like put your spikes out and be like, don't touch me, you know? And it's what Claire and I have noticed is there's so much in our lives that was just taken for granted, because that's what we take for granted, because that's what it was like in our home, you know? So, for example, Claire will always take her shoes off when she gets into the house, and I won't, because we didn't do that in our house, you know? Because you were in and out of the house.
You know, we're the same. I don't wear shoes in the house. Dan will maybe 50% of the time. It's very weird.
We were in and out of the house all the time. We'd be sort of playing out in the field, and it was a big house. And also, we didn't have carpet down, and because my mum did a lot of her curtains and loose covers from home, there was a very good chance you could step on a pin that had just been dropped, you know what I mean? And this has been such a contentious issue sometimes. Me and my flipping mother-in-law, I think, are going to have a confrontation about it at some point, you know? These weird little things. Because what we found was the arguments you have come out of nowhere, you know? And we'll agree on 99.9% recurring of stuff. And then we will have these long, drawn-out arguments about where the baby's nursery should go when they get, and why it should be this room and not that room, and all the rest of it. The arguments are going to come at you from nowhere, and you need to know how to deal with it and how to develop those skills. Now, it's, like I say, marriage counselling, it sounds scary, because you're going to have to talk to some guy, or let's be honest, everyone thinks it's going to be a guy. What it was like, in our case, we had a married couple who'd been married like 40 odd years or whatever. We'd come over, we'd watch the videos at their house, there'd be a discussion point, they would leave the room, and it would just be me and Claire talking about how we would deal with something. And it was really good, because it forces you to look at issues that you wouldn't do otherwise. And I think one of the best ways to avoid a divorce is to just make sure that you're having all those conversations as early as possible, you know?
Yeah, initially when Dan's cousin and his wife sort of told me about this, at first it was a bit, because I think internally a part of me always kind of wants to go, oh, well, the church, the big capital C church, oh, organised religion, oh, oppressiveness. So when they were like, oh yeah, they made us do marriage counselling, I was like, oh, made you, as if you don't know your own minds, how 1500s, how barbaric. Oh, but actually when they explained it, I think it is a very necessary, especially because obviously my cousin and his wife did not live together, I don't believe, prior to them getting married, or if they might have done, but not as long as perhaps me and Dan have been living together. So even things like, I have plenty of friends who I would not live with, I don't love them any less, I just would never live with them. And sometimes it's things like you don't know what's going to be like an impasse or a contentious issue sometimes until you get there. Like a few days ago, I was somewhat in my defense feeling a bit rough and under the weather at the time, but Dan asked me to move my mug further away from his PC. It wasn't that close to the PC, and I admit I overreacted a little bit, but we talked it out and we're over that now. But for some people that could have been a deal breaker. It could have been something way worse or way more. So marriage counselling, I think, sounds scary and sounds very kind of, oppressive and invasive, but actually I think it's a very necessary step.
It's really good. If I could make everybody do it, I would. It's not like a pass or fail, it's a course. It forces you to have the kind of conversations that you wouldn't have otherwise. Because if you're the person that brings it up, it can be a little bit weird. If you say, so are we going to have a joint bank account then, or what? Sounds really awkward. Whereas if somebody else says, are you guys planning on having a joint bank account? Then it deflates the issue a little bit. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of not putting the onus on one or the other to broach that subject.
Yeah. And like looking at like the marriage that we see in the Fabelmans, because I swear we started talking about a film at some point.
Yeah,
like,
the Spielmans, Fabelbergs, something like that.
Yeah. It does look like for a lot of the time that they are almost in a throuple. Do you know what I mean? With like Uncle Benny there, and I think the thing that gets to me is, I know with Mitzi we talk about like the mental health, and we talk about like the raising 4 kids in the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah.
But she couldn't have thought it was good for a marriage to have some dude around who she was falling in love with. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think the fact that when they move away from Benny and it kind of plunges her into such a depression, that really should have been, maybe they should have been divorced earlier.
Yeah.
Because I think then it kind of festered a bit, and
100%.
then when you finally rip off the Band-Aid, it just is worse, I think, than if you kind of start to address that.
Yeah, and I think
early on, but then I think Bert also was, I think there was a layer almost of animosity there, especially when they're driving in the car and he mentions how he had a funny dream that he and Uncle Benny had an argument and he punched him in the face. Hilarious. Really,
Totally.
I also have funny dreams where I punch people in the face.
I can't believe I'm coming back to it again, but it's that it's that King Arthur problem. Like, what do you do when you're pretty sure that your wife and your best friend are in love with each other? How can I put it? The phrase I like to use is, I know where all the threats to my marriage are.
It's Henry Cavill.
Henry freaking Cavill. Gillian Anderson. But
Gillian Anderson.
On a less sort of celebrity sort of status, you don't stop finding other people hot. Do you know what I mean? And me being me, I've often had these like really deep, really intense friendships with women that have still carried on, like from my teens and my 20s into my 30s and now my 40s. I remember breaking up with one girlfriend because I realised my feelings for her weren't as intense as they were for this one friend, So it's
player.
Yeah,
look at this. It's snapshot into teenage child's life.
It's this weird thing where you've got to know where the threats to your marriage are.
Yeah.
Like, have you heard of the Billy Graham rule?
I have not heard the Billy Graham rule.
So it's one that Mike Pence had a lot, and it was this idea that Billy Graham believed that he wouldn't be on his own with a woman he wasn't married to at all times,
Yeah.
And that's obviously incredibly restrictive, because if you're in a position of power and you won't be anywhere around a woman who's not your wife, that's gonna limit their possibilities. It's gonna limit your potential, and the rest of it. So that is an overly restrictive way of doing it. But there is something to be said for, don't put yourself in a situation where you could end up developing feelings for somebody else. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, kind of. I think that Billy Graham rule kind of takes it to the extreme idea that, a person and another person of the gender that attracts them can't just be friends, which is nonsense. But I think it's almost like it's not super frowned upon when girls kind of say, oh, well, I don't let him follow other girls on Instagram, or I don't let him text other girls. And it's like, no, that's not an okay thing to do. You have to, there has to be an element of trust, that you trust that, your significant other isn't going to go gallivanting off with your best friend. But, I think the idea that
But
you can be friends with the gender of person that you are attracted to.
100%, 100%. But
not be an issue,
maybe this is just me, or maybe this is a universal experience. I don't know. But there are some people of the gender that you're attracted to, and you know there's absolutely no chance that anything could ever happen with them.
Yeah.
And there are other people in your friendship group of the opposite gender who you could feel a physical or an emotional attraction to at some point in the right conditions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm not sure if I might be, again, I might be an only case, or there might be other people who feel this, but I don't find that with me personally. But then this is the spectrum of human experience, right?
So for me, like I say, there's some people who I can be like, yeah, let's hang out, let's do whatever, let's talk phrases, and then there's other people it's like, okay, I think you're great, and I'm absolutely nuts about you, and I need to stop this conversation here because I'm having way too much fun texting this person and texting me back, and that's going to end up with me feeling things I don't need to be feeling. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, this was one of the things that was quite handy about being a celibate Christian, meant that, like, unrequited love was my wheelhouse. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I knew exactly what it was, and you could get infatuated with a person, you could be nuts about them, but at some point you would have to sit yourself down and go, okay, dude, where do you picture this going? You know that this is a non-starter, you know? And I think
it's, with that kind of thing, you're almost chasing the new dopamine hit of new relationship, you know, because being in a long-term relationship, it's not, how Dan and I conduct ourselves now is not how we were conducting ourselves 7 odd years ago when we first started dating, or when he, was inviting me to group cinema trips that were no group term, and then he paid for my tickets, the rotten cad. But now it's like, right, we're going to the cinema, I'm off to watch Poor Things, you're off to watch One Life, we'll see you. So it's kind of recognizing, all right, it feels, right, I guess, at that point, but I guess it's just that dopamine, chasing that high of something that's new and fresh and whatever.
You hit on something that's really good there, like talking about that dopamine hit. Like, there's that kind of, I can't think of a better way to put it, but like that hunter kind of mentality when you're kind of looking for the next person. And if you wanted to kind of gamify it, you'd be like, I want to talk to them, I want them to talk to me, I want to spend time with them, I want them to spend time with me on their own. And you have that. And in my case, I had that for about 20 years before meeting my wife, So some of those kind of neural pathways kind of get locked on for quite a while. And again, that you're still going to fancy other people, and you're still going to find other people attractive. But again, what I was saying, I want my kids to look at my marriage and see it as like the gold standard. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I want them to see like as like mum and dad as the one true pair, and
the OTP of your children's life.
Yes. I was worried if I went in with the acronyms too early, people wouldn't get it. But
I was on Tumblr circa 2014. It's okay. You're among friends here. There's no judgment.
And it's like, I want these two things. They are antithetical, and you have to choose. But I already did choose. I already chose Claire. Do you know what I mean? I already chose having that. So it's trying to unlearn some pathways, some patterns of behavior that you got into and you were into for a very long time. And the people that can't have the self-reflection enough to do that are the ones that are going to drive their own marriages off a cliff. Do you know what I mean?
No, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And on the other hand, Dan was really my first and only very long-term partner. I had maybe like a couple of boyfriends at school, but they weren't, particularly involved or in depth. So my dating life has actually been quite monogamous. And I've been very lucky actually that I've sort of found my other jigsaw piece. So there is something to be said for slow dating. Sometimes it works out.
Yeah, see, when it comes to the exes, I always feel like that should be the shortest conversation you have. Like, I dated this person and that person before. I'm dating you now. I like you more. Let's stick with that, you know? Because the only time I've ever had to feel insecure about exes is when the girl in question won't stop mentioning them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not. I think it's unhealthy sometimes to dwell on that when it's, you know, they're not in your life anymore and they're not important, and the person that is important to you is in your life, and that's the end of it, really, I think, for me.
Definitely. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you have made it this far into what will certainly be our longest episode / therapy session, thank you so much.
Woo!
Please join us next week for what I hope will be a shorter episode on Under the Banner of Heaven. Julia, have you had a good time?
I've had a very good time. I feel like I've had a little bit of free therapy, which I always a little bit of marriage counselling just sprinkled in there for free, which I always appreciate.
Yeah, I love talking to you. It's brilliant. All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
God in Film is hosted and created by Giles Goff.
That's me.
Mixing and editing by Giles. Our logo was designed by
Julie Walsh.
And our theme tune was composed by
Rick Lee.
Waffle editing by
Natalie Miniker.
Please rate and review, unless it's a 1-star.
Business. Mainly through directing TV movies at first, until your talent for combining heartfelt narratives with awe-inspiring spectacle finally promotes you to directing features. Once you have taken over the film business and accrued enough industry clout, make an intimate personal film entitled Giles and Julia, This Episode Went On a Bit, Guys. I promise you we'll go see it.